Hi, I'm Nick. I'm going to do a quick talk on applications to IMT as part of the Make a Medic Heads Up series. Just a quick bit about me. So I'm doing an F3 year currently after finishing foundation training down in Brighton last year and applied to IMT training this cycle and I'm starting in August 2023. So should hopefully know a little bit about the application process, the self-assessment criteria, interview, stations for application, hopefully give a little bit of information about that. It is worth noting that everything does change year to year though, so it's worth making sure everything is still up to date. So just a few quick pros and cons about IMT training. So it's kind of, the pros and cons of medicine. So there's going to be a massive variety in your day-to-day job with IMT, with the different rotations and specialties that you'll be on. Variety with the patients you see, so those that you'll see on the acute take, the different diagnoses, investigations and treatments that we're initiating was a big plus for me. You also get some exposure into outpatient clinics, particularly in your second IMT year, as well as some experience in ITU. So I believe they need to provide you at least, I think it's 10 weeks of ITU experience during your free IMT years, but most of them end up being 3 to 4 months of ITU during your IMT training. You'll also get good exposure to the acute take, and IMT still leaves kind of the door open for going to a number of different specialties afterwards. So if you're not sure about kind of your career and which specialty you want to go into, it's that's a good plus. So the negatives, there's going to be a heavy on-call burden, as there is with all medical jobs. The majority of medical jobs. You're also, depending on which specialty you want to go into later on, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second, you might need to be a medical registrar, which can be a negative in a lot of ways, but can also be a positive. A lot of the registrars I've spoken to actually enjoy being a medical registrar much more than they preferred when they were a medical SHO, because of the impact you can have on your patients. But yeah, it's definitely something to bear in mind. You will feel like you're providing service provision at times, which I guess you are. And also the cost of the training itself and the exams that you'll need to sit. So the MRCP, the 2 writtens and the PACES practical exam. But I'll talk a bit more about that and the cost of MRCP in a bit. So just looking at an overview of the training program. So after foundation training, provided you get a job into IMT, you'll do IMT1, IMT2, and then depending which specialty you go into and which group it falls in will depend on whether you do IMT3 and kind of start doing medical reg shifts. So if you want to go into a group 1 specialty such as cardiology, gastroenterology, endo, then you'll need to do a 3rd IMT year, so IMT3, do medical, be a med reg, and then apply for your specialty training afterwards. If you were going into a group 2 specialty, so dermatology, haematology, then you would, after IMT2, you could break off and apply for that specialty, and so not required to be a med reg. But it's important to check that these specialties do still fall into the same groups, group 1 and group 2, as they have been known to change kind of from year to year. So then just a quick overview of the application process. So this was from this application cycle, so 2022, 2023. So it's worth making sure it's still the same. But the competition ratio for IMT was 2.45 applicants per job. So it's competitive, but kind of not terrible when you're comparing it to some other specialty applications and the ratios they have there. So in November you apply an Oriel, which is the same system as used for foundation training applications, and the application form consists of a lot of kind of generic kind of details, personal details, but then also some white space questions. So we had two main white space questions, which were asking about your commitment to IMT and medicine, and then also what you've done so far in your career, medical school, to prepare yourself for IMT training. And then they have the potential to ask you questions based off those white space answers at interview. And then another big part of the application is the self-assessment score that you provide. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But you basically go through a number of sections and score yourself based on what you've done. So one section is teaching, and so if you've organised a local teaching programme and provided teaching over 3 or more months, then you'd score yourself X number of points, and then there's a little white space section underneath where you justify the points that you've given yourself. And although they didn't ask for evidence this year, they can ask you to provide evidence for the score that you've given yourself, and so it's important that you do have that evidence and don't overscore yourself, but also don't undersell yourself, because from that self-assessment score, that's how you're shortlisted for interview. So if you meet a certain number of points, then you'll get given an interview, which will be held in January or February, which this year had 3 stations, which again I'll talk about later on, and then kind of the whole score comes from that interview, which then provides you with the rankings for your rankings for potential job offers, which tend to come out in April. Okay, so I'm now going to go through the self-assessment score from this most recent cycles application, and talk about kind of the ways you can get points, and you can self-assess yourself, and kind of trying to highlight the sections where it's quite easy to get points quickly if you're kind of coming up to application this year or the following year, and other sections where it can take a little bit more time, but it's still worthwhile thinking about, because after IMT training, for kind of specialty, for registrar applications, a lot of the scoring points will be quite similar and transferable, so it's worth noting that for after IMT training as well. So the self-assessment score was the score that's used to shortlist you for interview. So if you reach a certain number of points and meet that threshold, then you'll get offered an interview afterwards. One section's on teaching, and this is a section where it's relatively easy to get kind of up to maximum points in a relatively short period of time, so kind of up to 3 months. So to get the maximum number of points, 6 points, you need to work with local tutors to organise a teaching programme for healthcare professionals, medical students, where you also teach regularly over 3 months, and you need to have evidence of formal feedback. So if you're in your foundation training, this could be relatively easy just to contact the educational department there, ask whether you could set up a teaching programme for the medical students, ensure it's 3 months longer, possibly involve other doctors, healthcare staff there to be part of the teaching programme, and then just make sure you get the formal feedback as well, as that will be important in case evidence is needed to be shown. And yeah, you get 3 points if you don't organise the teaching programme but can provide evidence of 3 months or longer of teaching, and then 1 point if you've occasionally taught healthcare professionals, medical students. So this is quite a good section where if you plan and give yourself time, you could get maximum points. Next section is leadership. Again, this one's going to take a bit more time, but if you kind of have time, plan it, you could potentially get some more points here. So 2 points if you've held a local leadership or managerial role for 6 or more months and can demonstrate a positive impact, which I think with most leadership or managerial roles should be relatively easy to demonstrate some positive impact. So again, if you're foundation training, you could think about trying to become mess president, being on the mess committee, being a local sports club captain, so that's relatively easy to try, and as long as you plan it, to get a couple of points there. Or if you want to kind of try and get the maximum points, you could think about trying to become a BMA representative to show that you've held a national, regional leadership managerial role for 6 or more months. So yeah, potential to get to score relatively well here if you give yourself time and plan it out well. Quality improvement. This is definitely one we should be hopefully trying to get all 5 points. So 5 points if you're involved in all stages of 2 cycles of equip. So yeah, kind of whether you're foundation training or kind of before or after. Yeah, if you can, be involved, set up a equip, make sure it's got 2 cycles. I believe the year before this application year, because they changed the self-assessment criteria slightly. I think it used to be to get maximum points, it was all stages of 3 cycles of equip. So it's potentially worthwhile doing 3 cycles just to be safe, and then you can also use that kind of for later on applications as well potentially. And you get 3 points out of the 5 if you're involved in some stages of 2 cycles of equip or all stages of a single cycle, and then 1 point if you're involved in some stages of a single cycle. So this is definitely one where you can hopefully try and get all 5 points. Presentations and posters. So there's quite a few points available here, up to 7. So this is potentially where if you've done a quip or potentially some research in the past, you can try and present that at ideally a national international meeting, otherwise at a regional. So you get all 7 if you've done an oral presentation. So oral presentation scores better than a poster, in which you're a first or second author at a national, international, and then 5 points if it's a poster at a national, international meeting, or an oral presentation at a regional meeting, and then 2 points for an oral presentation or poster at a local medical meeting. So yeah, potentially kind of going off the back of that quip or other research you've done, you could try and get some more points here for the application. So the next section's publications, and there's quite a few points here, up to 8. But it is going to be, they're going to take a little bit more time to get, and you're not going to get kind of in a shorter period of time compared to some of the other sections. So you get 8 out of 8 points for the first author, joint first author, or co-author of 1 or more PubMed cited original research publications, and then kind of subsequently get less and less points based on being co-author, and then kind of author of PubMed cited other publications, so case reports, letters, reviews, but I'll let you read through that kind of in your own time because there's quite a bit of information there. But if you have kind of less time available, then trying to kind of get some case reports out, letters to the editor, are likely in ways that you can try and get kind of some points a bit quicker than trying to get the maximum points with some being the first author or joint first author, co-author of an original research publication. But definitely kind of quite a lot of points available there. Postgraduate section is also another section that's going to be difficult to get points in a short period of time, as the maximum points requires you to have a PhD or MD. That'll get you 4 points. Masters of at least 8 months in length would get you 3, and then 1 point would get you 1 point would be for another postgraduate diploma or a postgraduate certificate. So that's going to take quite a bit of time if you want to get kind of some points there, and even then the points aren't in the whole kind of grand scheme of it. There's not lots of points available. But it's probably worth still trying to find out from, if you're in a training program, from foundation training, seeing whether they might potentially fund something like a postgraduate certificate, which is what my trust down in Brighton did for me as part of my academic foundation program. And although that doesn't kind of give you many points, only gives you a point for the self-application assessment, it is then something good that you can talk about at interview, and to show your commitment to medicine and your interest outside of foundation training into medicine. So it is something to potentially look into. Additional achievements, these will be things that you either have or don't have. So 3 points if you had a high achievement award for your primary medical qualification, so honours distinction that was awarded to no more than the top 18% of your cohort. 2 points if you had an international or national prize related to medicine, and 1 point if one or more prizes, distinctions, merits related to parts of your medical course at uni that weren't given to more than 20%. So again, that's likely to be something that you either have or don't have. I'm going to move on and just talk a little bit about the MRCP. so the exams that you need to sit as part of kind of going through IMT and going to medical specialties. And although these don't provide any points currently for the self-assessment criteria, it does look good. Again, going to interview, being able to talk about this, say you've sat MRCP Part 1, potentially Part 2, it shows your commitment to medicine, to the training programme, and the fact that you've already kind of put the time in to revise, spent money on the exams, shows your commitment. So Part 1 and Part 2 are written exams, which are currently online. Part 1 you have to sit 12 months after graduating medical school, which is a bit annoying because a lot of the content is very similar to finals for med school, but it does include around 20% of preclinical knowledge, which is a little bit more difficult to remember, as it might have been kind of what you did at the start of medical school. Part 2, again, written exam online, similar to Part 1, but more clinical specialist related, so less preclinical knowledge in there. And PACES is the clinical exam that you usually do during your IMT training, and that is done in person with examiners, and based on availability, you can have to go and sit it all over the UK to find a centre that's available. And in regards to cost, Part 1 and Part 2, £450 each, and then PACES is £650. And it's worth noting, if you don't pass the first time, you have to pay that again, so it can be very costly. Okay, so provided you meet the shortlisting score from the self-assessment criteria, you'll then get invited to interview, which is in usually January, February time. This is a 25-minute interview that consists of 3 different stations, so suitability to application, a clinical station, and then also an ethical station as well. And it tends to be that 100% of the score that's used to rank you between all of our applicants is derived from the interview. So it's very important that you score as highly as you can. So the first station is the suitability to the IMT station. This is 8 minutes long and starts with a 2-minute presentation on an overview of your achievements to date, which are most relevant to your application to be a trainee in internal medicine. So this is 2 minutes where the interviewers, after introducing themselves, just give you 2 minutes for you to speak, give your presentation, won't interrupt you. You can't use any aids or any kind of visual effect, it's all just spoken. And I don't believe you can use any, but you can't write anything down either and read off a sheet, so it needs to be rehearsed, but still trying to sound as natural as possible, to kind of present your arguments as to kind of the achievements that you have and why they're appropriate to your application. Following on from that, you'll have 6 minutes of questions regarding your suitability, so those can be from the interviews asking questions based on what you've just spoken about for those 2 minutes. It can be also based off those white space questions that you filled in on Oriel in your application, and then it can also be separate to that, generic suitability questions, so based on things like teamwork, leadership, quips. So they're likely to go back to your self-assessment criteria quite a bit, but it's worth being prepared for anything that they could possibly ask you there. And also with the suitability station, I'd say reading the IMT curriculum booklet, which is I think about a 30-40 page booklet that they'll send you, but you can also just find on the IMT website, is very important. It tells you the learning outcomes, which they could potentially kind of ask you whether you know what the learning outcomes are for IMT and what your thoughts are on them. It tells you the structure of the programme, in a lot more depth than what I've spoken about here, and just gives you a lot of information that you can then produce to the interviewers and kind of show your commitment, show your understanding of the programme, that you're happy with the programme that you're going into and aren't going to kind of have second thoughts once you go into it. So following on from that, you'll have a 12-minute clinical station. So you'll have 3 minutes to review a scenario, a little blurb on kind of potentially an acute case, potentially something else related to medicine. Then you'll have 8 minutes for kind of questioning after that. So it's important here to be very confident in your A to E. If it is an acute station, being able to rattle through your A to E kind of succinctly, but safely as well, showing that you're going to be a safe trainee, but also being able to kind of expand on the specific scenario and show off your medical knowledge as well. And I found, so I sat my MRCP Part 1 about a month before my interview, and found it very useful to have that knowledge from the MRCP ready for the clinical station, and particularly for kind of because my station was not particularly acute, but they were asking kind of quite a few kind of medical questions that that were kind of quite related to, very related to the exam that I just sat, and so I found it useful having that knowledge from the revision. And then after those kind of questions at the clinical station, you'll have 1 minute to hand over. And so they likely will kind of cut you short if you are overrunning there. So it's important to, in your preparation for the interview, to time yourself, giving yourself a 1 minute handover, using the S-bar technique to hand over, because it is something that I didn't realise when I started kind of preparing and started actually kind of recording timing myself doing a handover, how long my handovers were and how kind of waffly they were, whereas you can kind of succinct them down quite easily just with a lot of practice. And then the third and final station is the ethical station. This is 5 minutes where, again, they'll give you a little brief on an ethical scenario, or they'll just tell you a little ethical scenario, and then you'll have 5 minutes to answer questions around the ethical case. So here it's kind of having, it's a good idea to have a kind of a bit of a structure to your answer, as every scenario you're going to get is most likely going to involve kind of patients, ensuring that you're prioritising patient safety. There'll be further information. They're only going to give you a very brief amount of information, so being able to ask for relevant further information. Normally you're going to be escalating to your seniors, obviously it'll depend on the case, but these are all things that, if you kind of put into when you're practicing interviews, if you have kind of a set structure, can mean you don't miss out anything kind of crucial that's going to be unsafe or kind of unethical. And it is also worth the ethical station kind of having a read, looking up on kind of certain things that are kind of that are likely to pop up. So around capacity is always a big one that comes up in ethics stations. Gillett competency, Fraser guidelines, those sort of kind of those sort of topics are very useful to be aware of and be ready to discuss in a bit more detail. And this is the interview scoring sheet for this year. So it was out of so the two interviewers in each interview who would mark you out of 5 for a number of different sections. And then it had different weighting depending on the section. So section 1, your suitability for application, they'd score you out of 5 on your application achievements, and then that'd be weighted at 1.6 times, and then they'd also rate you on your suitability for IMT. So just kind of highlighting a few specific points. So out of the total 80 points, 32 of those come from your suitability. So it's very important you've prepared your 2-minute presentation well, and you're ready to answer questions on your suitability, on the application, on the IMT curriculum, on all the questions they can ask you related to that, because there's 32 out of the 80 points are available there. It's also worth noting that just for the 1 minute handover, that does give you 10% of the marks, so making sure you don't neglect that 1 minute handover and you practice that a lot in your interview practices is important, as it can get you a lot of marks in a short period of time. And then also there were 12 points out of the 80 just for general communication. So if you're kind of coming across well, presenting yourself well, delivering your A to E succinctly, then it's kind of, you'll hopefully follow on that you'll get close to those 12 points. Okay, and I'm just going to finally speak a little bit about what you can do now to prepare for IMT applications. So I've spoken about Most of this during the self-assessment section, but just a few more little things. So with regards to teaching, leadership, quips and research that you can think about doing now, you could potentially think about doing a teaching qualification. You can think about, definitely think about doing the quip, and as that's a section of the self-assessment criteria that you can certainly get all the points relatively easily in a short period of time. So make sure you do a 2-cycle, potentially a 3-cycle, just to be safe, because of how it's been in the past, where maximum points required 3 cycles, whereas now it's just 2. And that's also something that there is a potential for them to ask you at interview as well, about a quip that you've done that you feel has impacted kind of positively upon patients' care. Publications and presentations. A teaching program is another one that's in a short period of time is relatively easy to get high marks, and is also something you can talk about well at interview, showing your commitment to medicine and to teaching, and kind of the teaching that you provided in the past. Qualifications and experience. So kind of sitting the MRCP, kind of, even if it's just part 1, looks good when you speak about it at interview, even if it doesn't provide you points for that self-assessment criteria. Potentially thinking about doing other courses kind of related to the specialty that you want to go into. One that's going to be helpful for you going forward, and again, it's something you can talk about interview. If you've completed foundation training and kind of taking a year out, potentially thinking about doing a medical fellow job. Again, that's going to show your commitment, going to look good for interview. And then potentially a postgraduate certificate or other qualification related to medicine. And then demonstrating your commitment to specialty. So again, doesn't provide any points for that self-assessment section, but will look good when you can say that you've had taster days in the specialty of your choice that you're hoping to go into, and just making sure you explore the specialties out there, so you can have an idea yourself of kind of what your career is going to be like after IMT training, in case they ask about that at interview. And then, provided you get an interview, the things that you can do before the interview. So there's definitely a huge amount of preparation you can do for it. I definitely recommend reading the IMT curriculum that they send out, and is on the internet at the moment on the IMT website. Better idea about the curriculum itself, about the learning objectives that they're going to expect you to know at interview. Make sure you prepare that 2-minute presentation very well, as that makes up a large portion of the points that the suitability to IMT training section makes up a lot of the interview points. So making sure it's very well prepared, but still trying to sound as natural as possible, and making sure that you're going to be able to kind of repeat that presentation as well in a stressful interview situation is very important. Practice your A2E, practice the acute cases. I believe that Make Medic is sending out or preparing kind of acute cases document that's going to have kind of the major cases. So kind of say stroke, they'll put in kind of what you'd expect to see in your A2E, investigations, other potential differentials, and then management steps as well afterwards. So kind of being very confident with your acute cases is very important, being very well practiced with your A2E as well. Do kind of general basic ethical reading. Relating to things like capacity, competency, lasting powers of attorney, all the potential ethical things that can come up, and having a good structure to your ethical answer as well will make a big difference. And then I'd say the biggest thing is making sure you practice a huge amount. Kind of quite a bit of the interview can the interview you can actually kind of practice and just speak out loud, record yourself, listen back to it. So with the 2-minute presentation, if you're kind of practicing an answer for an acute case, practicing your A2E, and then your handover as well, that's something you can do kind of on your own, but then also making sure you do practices and lots of mocks with your with friends, colleagues. Ideally who are doing IMT applications as well, but also those who are going to other specialties. There's always a huge crossover. Most of the Most of the other specialties are going to involve sections about suitability to that specialty, about having a clinical scenario, and about ethics as well. So yeah, trying to find other colleagues and friends who you can practice with will make a big difference. Okay, and that's everything. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch.